All right, so what we're going to get into now that we've talked about texturing and how I kind of blocked out the lighting for this scene for the final lighting is let's talk a little bit about some elements that are in here in the final comp. So this is the final 6K comp for the print. I actually did the After Effects comp for the animation first, and then used that to determine what I wanted to do in Photoshop. But regardless, it's easier to just talk about it inside here. And so what I want to do is just turn off a bunch of things that are unrelated to what we're talking about. And so specifically some of these particle related passes or some of these fire and smoke related passes. Let me get those out of here. And let's hide the character for a sec. And looks like I've got a couple other smoke elements inside here that I can get rid of. Brink. All right. And there's also some particles back there I can get rid of. So aside from some color correction nodes that are in the scene, which we've talked about before, what we're looking at is a render from this scene file. So this is test lighting 27, so it's my final scene file for the environment. And this is used to render the environment's beauty pass. The character was rendered from a separate scene file. Basically, this scene is ready to render the environment with textures, with shaders, with lighting, and the beauty pass includes diffuse and specular illumination as well as shadows. But the render that I do from this scene does not include fog. And so those are inside this scene, meaning that as I did test renders trying to see what the fog might look like with the environment and with textures and stuff, I did mess around in here. But to really finalize the look of the fog, I did that separately based on some look dev that I'd done in Photoshop. And if we look at what those passes are in Photoshop, basically what we have is some near fog and some rear fog, and then the glow or smoke that's rising from these pits. And so we can see there's that, the rear fog, and the near fog. So once I turn those off and get rid of some of the color correction nodes that are inside here, this is basically what it looks like coming out of Maya. And then obviously the environment's rendered without the sky, and that's also rendered separately. So with these passes, if we take a look at what they are, if we start, let's say, with the pit smoke pass, let me just put that into its own document. These are rendered with volume primitives. So you can see it's rendered with the color and the density of the volume primitive mapped with solid textures. And it's rendered so that the geometry in the scene renders as black so that it's easy to composite. And so I can just screen this into my comp. And the same thing goes for the fog passes that are in here. So my near fog, you can see I copied it in here a couple times just to make it brighter. But if I select that, copy it, make a new document and paste that in, we can see it's not just a gradient, that it does have 3D information inside it. So again, the geometry renders as black, which is a simple change to the shaders. And then I get this volumetric fog effect for the near fog. And then let me go and grab this. And we can see the rear fog. So the fog that's in the distance has a warm tint to it, and the fog that's in the near ground has a cool tint to it. These can be rendered with those colors in Maya, but in the end it's easy to color correct and tint them. It's just really the placement and density of these. And so with that said, let's jump over to Maya to see how that's set up. And then as far as how they're comped in here, you can see the pit smoke is just set to linear dodge, the fog is set to screen, and you can see that there are pretty low opacity values. So the way that I choose to composite it as far as screening versus applying one of these as a linear dodge, I can experiment within After Effects or Photoshop to create the final look. But let's talk about how they're made. So going over to Maya, with my scene file set up for the beauty pass, let's now switch to a scene file for one of these fog elements. So I have my final scene inside here, but then you can see I have these scenes set up to render different passes. So let's start, let's say, with the environment fog. So with that open, when I create scene files for different passes, well, granted you can create a single scene file and use render layers and render passes in the scene to try and get everything split out at one go. I like to separate it at different scenes. I just find it easier to manage later if I need to re-render a pass. And so this one's for the environment fog. And inside here, I've just deleted things from the scene that have nothing to do with rendering this pass. So it'll be a lighter scene, easier to open and manage, and will potentially render faster. So I've got everything grouped together inside here. And we'll see that I've got a group called volume primitives. But we'll also see I've got my fog nodes, which is specifically what this scene is. So these volume primitives are hidden. The only one that's visible is this one. So this scene was saved so that I could render the near fog, which is the bluish fog that was sort of in the upper left. And then I could then make this invisible and make this visible to render the rear fog. And so if I just make them both visible and switch to a different camera, we can see here's the near fog and here's the rear fog. So I'm using volume primitives instead of using environment fog just because it's volumetric, meaning that with these I just create them by going to create volume primitives, choose a shape. So for this I'm using cubes. I can scale them up, and then again I just want to make sure that I turn on volume samples override for these and increase the samples, especially if your camera is going to be inside the fog. And so the main benefit with volume primitives is that if you map their density with, let's say, a solid fractal or cloud texture or something, you can actually fly through that texture in 3D. And then also, shadows from geometry get cast into the volume or into the fog. And that's not something you can do with normal Maya environment fog. So if you go to Render Globals, switch to Maya Software, go to Render Options, and create environment fog this way, it's really useful for certain scenes because it renders really fast, but it's not truly volumetric. So if I had a scene where I had a mountain range with a sun setting behind the mountain range, clearly the mountains would cast a shadow into the fog that's between us and the mountains. And environment fog doesn't do that. So sometimes the fog looks brighter in areas than it should. While volume primitives, on the other hand, do calculate correctly so that you're not going to get bright fog in nooks and crannies that clearly should be in shadow, as long as you turn on volume samples override and increase the sample setting. So with these, it's just a matter of deciding the density, the color, whether you want to map their density. And when you create a volume primitive, it automatically creates a volumetric shader that's assigned to it. So if I go into Hypershade and I say select materials from objects, I'm going to see there's one of my volume primitive materials. So you can see this one is set to be relatively dark. It's illuminated, an important checkbox. By default that's off, but if you want the lights in your scene to actually illuminate the fog, cast shadows into it, and color the fog based on the color of the light, you would turn that on. And then the sort of fall off of the light into the fog is based on this slider. That's what light scatter is. And so for my environment fog in the scene, I have not mapped the density or transparency or anything. It's just a simple volume primitive with volume samples override turned on, and it's illuminated with a low light scatter. And so that's basically it. It's ready to render. And so the only other thing I need to do to render this pass for the volume primitives is to make sure that my geometry renders as black in a render. And so to do that, if I go to any one of these objects and I look at its shader, and I go to the matte opacity folder, you'll see that I've set it to black hole. The default is opacity gain. So by setting it to black hole, the object will render as black in the RGB and in the alpha. And so that just means that it's sort of a holdout matte. So all the objects that I have in my scene, you can see this object has blend 14, looking right there, black hole. This object there, blend 23, black hole. That object there, blend 16, black hole. So for all of the shaders in my scene, as you can see, I've set the matte opacity to black hole. So with all of the objects in my scene set to black hole, with my fog set to render, and then the lights in my scene visible, I'm basically able to illuminate the fog and get a render. And what I also did inside here, as we can see, is I created a point light for my near fog and another point light that's hidden right now, which is all the way back there, for the rear fog. So instead of using the scene lights, I hid all the lights that are in the scene, and for my fog pass decided to make custom lights. And so these are just point lights. If I go inside here, I can see that I've got shadows on for them. I'm using depth map shadows for them just because it renders a little bit faster. I've got a very fast quadratic decay on this light, which forced me to put a really, really bright intensity on it, just so that I would get a really strong gradient from the near ground into the scene. So when I render the fog pass for the near fog, I just hide the rear fog volume primitive and its light. And this is really what I'm interested in, the volume primitive and the light source. Everything else set to black hole, and then the result, again, if I select copy, new, paste, is a render that looks like this. So it is 3D. I can take my camera move, if I had one, for the environment and bring it into this scene file and render it out as a volumetric 3D fog effect. So pretty simple setup, really. You just need to understand how volume primitives work. So that's how I did the near fog and the rear fog. And so once I had those passes, then in my comp, I can just load them in. And as you see here, this one I set to screen, and this one I set to screen as well. And I just lowered the opacity down to tune it to what I want, because obviously if I had these at 100% opacity, that near fog would be a lot stronger than what I was looking for. So I can just sort of dial that in. So that pretty much covers the environment fog. As far as the fog that's coming from these pits, that fog right there, let's go into Maya and let's open the scene file for that, which is this one, pit fog. So in this scene, again, I've gotten rid of everything that I don't need. I just have the volume primitives. And after a little bit of experimenting with the volume primitives in the scene, I ended up deciding that I wanted to, let's go inside here and find where they are, use cone-shaped volume primitives instead of using cubes. And so a lot of my initial tests were done with cubes, but instead of using volume primitive cubes, here I'm using cones, just because I preferred the way that the shape of the fog was kind of going out from the pits with an angle instead of going straight up. And I scaled them up large enough so that from my render cam, they're scaled up large enough so they go outside the edge of frame, so I don't get like a clipping at the edge of the volume primitive. I do have them set to fade out way before they get to the end, so the fact that I see the edge there doesn't really matter, but it's just sort of scaling them up to be safe. And they're relatively large just so that I can get the verticality of the fog to be relatively linear but have a little bit of an angle to it. So for all of these volume primitives that are inside here, it's the same thing. You want to turn on volume samples override, put the volume samples to 30. But for these, as opposed to having them being illuminated by scene lights or by point lights, these are handled a little differently. So if I go into Hypershade and let's go and select material from object, let's take a look at this one. So here is the material for this volume primitive. So you can see that I'm giving it a color. We can see inside here that I've adjusted the color ramp input to concentric, just so from the center to the edge of the cone it has a color. And then you can see I've textured the transparency and the density, so you can see they're textured, and they are not illuminated by scene lights. And so meaning it's glowing because it's this glowing fog smoke stuff coming from that pit. And so the way that it's textured, you can see a bunch of things chained together. So I have a volume noise, which is a 3D texture mapped to the transparency, and then I have another volume noise mapped to density, a solid fractal mapped to the alpha gain of the volume noise, and then a projected ramp going into the alpha gain of the solid fractal. And so in here, this chain of 3D projected textures that are projecting through the volume primitive allow me to design the look of it. So this is something that if you haven't played with volume primitives before, just make one and start mapping density and transparency with 3D textures, meaning not these 2D textures, but your 3D textures. And any of them will give you interesting results, but I'm using solid fractals and volume noises just because they're more smoky looking. And while I'm using a projected ramp here, as we can see with this one, just to project it from the side so I can control the density of the fog from the bottom of the scene to the top of the scene. So you can see it's got a low density, gets thicker, remains thick, and then fades off as we get to the top of the cone shape of the volume primitive. So this is sort of controlling the density on the y-axis of my volume primitive. And so the end result of mapping all of these things into this node is that I get something that is three-dimensional, meaning that if the camera moves around it, it'll look correct. But it is simple to set up, renders quickly, and you can even go into these textures if you want to, and let's say animate the time attribute on them. And so if you do that, then if you rendered a camera move, you could create like a rolling wispy fog effect that you can move the camera through. So yes, you could do this kind of thing with particles, but I used volume primitives just because I knew the setup time would be easy and fast, and they render really quick. So in the end, you can see it gives me the glow from the pits that I want, but again, the look of it when rendered by itself is this. So all of the objects in my scene are set to black hole, so they're going to be blocking the volume primitives, and by mapping the density with the fractals and the volume noise, I get this kind of wispy look that by itself looks a little artificial, obviously, but when comped into the image, it looks fine. And if I did render an animation for this pass, this stuff could be moving or moving vertically or morphing or whatever if I wanted to, but that's not what I was doing. But you can see once comped in, it just adds the glow that I wanted in a three-dimensional nature, as opposed to doing it with gradients in 2D or whatnot. So here I have it set to linear dodge with opacity at 64. If I make it a little bit stronger or experiment with different blending modes, we can see inside here, especially with, let's say, linear dodge, color dodge, the effects that you can get with that. None of those are useful. Let's say we just go to linear dodge again. And then with this one, obviously if I went to the levels on it and started cranking the contrast in it, you can start to really sort of see the detail that is inside the volume primitive if I wanted that. So that's the cool thing about it, is that it's a 3D effect. So I can sort of bump the contrast on these and then maybe lower the saturation down on it and make it a little bit less red. And now you can see I've gotten a different look. That's also cool. So there's a lot of detail inside that volume primitive, and it's cool that it's actually three-dimensional. But let's just undo a couple steps back to kind of the way I had it, somewhere in here, and it serves its purpose. So that is how I approach the fog in the environment. So we've got our rear orange fog, our near cool bluish fog, and then the pit fog, all done with volume primitives. And so the only other pass scene that I have, if we go to Maya, that I used is my Z-depth pass. And if we open that up, same thing, it's a scene just by itself. But the way this is set up, if I select any of these objects, is, let me try and remember how I set it up. Um, what I did for this one, for Z-depth, there's different ways to render Z-depth passes, but I basically created normal Maya environment fog. Let's find that in here. So this is normal environment fog. The stuff that I mentioned isn't truly volumetric, but for a Z-depth pass, it's useful. So meaning by going to Maya software, render options, applying normal environment fog to the scene, and then I can switch back to mental ray and it'll render with mental ray. And then for this fog, I deleted the lights in my scene so that my scene will render as completely black. I didn't set things to black hole, I just got rid of all the lights. So if I do a render, it's black. And then my environment fog that I have inside here, which let me go and actually grab it through Hypershade, is right there, is set to white. And I set the saturation distance pretty far. So I have a scene with no lights in it, which means it renders as black. And then I have white fog. And so in the end, what that means is that things that are far away become white, and things that are close are black. And then if I invert that, I get a Z-depth pass. And the nice thing about creating Z-depth passes this way is that they are correctly anti-aliased, and I can render them at 16-bit if I need to. But that's my Z-depth pass. And so if we go back out to Photoshop, we can see that I have a bunch of alpha channels in here. Some of them are a little bit obvious, right, for different elements. But you can see here is my Z-depth pass. And so what's near the camera is dark, and what's far away from the camera is light. So this is just a scene with no lights with fog. And since the fog, doesn't pay attention to shadows or anything, since this is normal environment fog, you can see that areas inside here are getting fog. While if it was a volume primitive with lights casting shadows, obviously you wouldn't expect the fog to be bright inside there. But for a Z-depth pass, we do, because it's all based on distance. And so I can then use that Z-depth file to apply depth of field to the scene. And that's something that I did do inside this scene. So if we go to our layers, we can see inside here that here is my original background. So if we zoom in, you can see that everything is in focus. While if I turn this version on, you can see it's out of focus. Although, of course, as I scroll down, things that are closer to camera are in focus. So this is depth of field, and it's applied using the Z-depth pass. And so meaning that I render that Z-depth pass from Maya with the fog, import that into Photoshop. I can put it on a layer or put it on a channel. And then I take a flattened version of my background, which is what I have right here, and then I just go to Filter, Blur, Lens Blur. And then with the lens blur, I can go and specify, let's see if I can size this down a little bit. With lens blur, then I specify the source. And so it's showing me all of my alpha channels. So I specify the Z-depth pass. And then with that, I can go and adjust the blur focal distance and the amount of blur. So you can see if I increase the blur, you can see that it's getting blurry back there, but it's staying in focus in the center because my focal distance is at the midpoint. If I bring the focal distance closer to camera, you can see that now it's in focus near camera, but blurry back there. So that's making the scene look a little small. So let's just lower the radius of the blur down so that the near ground is in focus, the background has a little bit of blur to it. So there you go. So that's the lens blur in Photoshop to apply depth of field, which is super useful using a Z-depth pass. And so that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about with our final comp, which was how I created the fog, the near fog, the rear fog, and the pit smoke using volume primitives, and then how to use Z-depth pass to add depth of field. So now that we've talked about lighting and got into the final comp, then I guess we can start talking about some of the effects that are in the scene as far as particle stuff that are 3D. So we'll look at the 3D effects first, and then we'll look at 2D effects later, and then we can talk about the character animation. And so now for 3D effects.